as signs of the times, Michael's battle and its reflection on earth. At the present time of severe trials, it must be quite natural to anyone who has a heartfelt interest in the endeavors of anthroposophical spiritual science to reflect upon the relations existing between the fact that this spiritual scientific movement started at the beginning of the 20th century to send its impulses into the evolution of mankind, and the other fact that mankind of the present age has been engulfed by catastrophic events. How catastrophic these events are for mankind has not yet been fully understood, for people are accustomed today to a life without the Spirit. To live without the Spirit, however, is to live superficially, and to live superficially causes human beings to sleep away the important impressions of the events taking place around them. To sleep through important events is a special characteristic of the human being of the present age. There are few people today who arrive at an adequate conception of the severity and incisiveness of present-day events. Most of them live from day to day. If an attempt is made to speak of a time which might come later, people, and in many instances precisely those upon whom matters depend, reject it most violently. If among its many tasks spiritual science succeeds in making the human soul more energetic, more awake, it will have fulfilled an important one for our present time. Spiritual scientific concepts demand a greater exertion of thinking, a greater intensity of feeling than is employed in other concepts, particularly those current in our time. It is important today to become acquainted with the concepts of spiritual research which can direct and guide us in the understanding of the present age in the most comprehensive sense. Today I shall develop some fundamental concepts upon which we shall build ideas in our next lecture, which will throw light upon important factors of the present age. I shall proceed from more general thoughts touching upon the personal in man, which from a certain point of view will furnish the foundation for our subsequent spiritual scientific considerations. My dear friends, in the course of our spiritual scientific studies, we must again and again emphasize the fact that a change in our state of consciousness runs through our life between birth or conception and death, the change between sleeping and waking. In a general sense, we know the difference between sleeping and waking. In a more intimate way, only spiritual scientific perception is able to demonstrate to the human soul the true difference between sleeping and waking. In ordinary life, we believe that we sleep from falling asleep until awakening, but that we are awake from awakening until falling asleep. But this is only an approximate truth. In reality, the boundary between sleeping and waking is incorrectly drawn. For the state of dull consciousness, which in many respects is unconsciousness, through which we pass as the sleep state extends into our day life, we are also within this state with part of our being between awakening and falling asleep. We are by no means awake with our entire being between awakening and falling asleep. We are awake only with a part of it, and another part continues to sleep even though we consider ourselves to be awake. We are always, in a certain respect, sleeping human beings. It is really so. We are really awake only in regard to our perception and our thinking. By perceiving the external world through our senses, by hearing, seeing, and so forth, we are awake in this hearing, seeing, and perceiving. We are completely awake there. We are also awake, although to a lesser degree, in thinking, visualizing. When we form thoughts, when visualizations arise in us, when memories emerge out of the dark recesses of our soul life, we are awake in regard to the processes which we experience. we are awake in regard to the processes of perception and thinking. You know, however, that besides perception and thinking, our soul life contains feeling and willing. In regard to feeling, we are not awake, even though we believe we are. The degree, the intensity of consciousness we have while feeling equals the degree and intensity of consciousness we have while dreaming. And just as dreams arise as pictures out of the unconscious recesses of our souls, so do feelings arise as forces in us. In feeling, we are awake to the same degree as in dreaming. The only difference is this: we carry our dreams over from sleep into ordinary waking consciousness, remembering them and thus distinguishing them from the waking state. While in the case of feelings, all this takes place simultaneously. Feeling itself is being dreamt in us, but we accompany our feeling with our conceptions. Feeling is not within the conceptions, but we look from conceptions upon feeling just as we look back after awakening upon the dream. And since we do this simultaneously in the case of feeling, we are not aware of the fact that we have only the conception of feeling in actual consciousness, while feeling itself remains in the dream region, like any dream. And will itself, my dear friends, what do you know of the processes occurring when you resolve to take hold of a book, and your hand then actually seizes the book? What do you know of that which takes place between your conscious thought, I want to take hold of the book, and the mysterious processes then occurring in your organism? We know what we think about willing, but willing itself remains unknown to us in ordinary consciousness. Whereas we dream away our feeling, we sleep away the actual essential content of our willing. As perceiving, thinking human beings, we are awake. But as feeling and willing human beings, we dream and sleep, even in the waking state. Thus, in feeling and willing, the sleep state extends into our waking consciousness. The state in which we are, between falling asleep and awakening, in regard to our whole being, is the state in which we live during our waking consciousness, in regard to our feeling and willing. Through perception and thinking, we learn to know a world around us, which we designate as the physical sense world. Through feeling and willing, we do not learn to know the world in which we exist as feeling and willing human beings. We are constantly in a supersensible world. The forces of our feeling and willing originate in this supersensible world, just as our perception and thinking originate in the physical world. We have no bodily organs for feeling and willing. We do have bodily organs for perception and thinking. Many physiologists believe that organs for feeling and willing exist. This shows that they do not know what they are talking about. Physiologists who really think do not believe this. What I have described above is the ordered state in which we live between birth and death, a state in which we are awake in regard to perception and thinking, but asleep in regard to feeling and willing. The condition is different between death and a new birth. It is reversed in a certain sense. We begin then to be awake in regard to our feeling and willing, and we sleep away our perception, our thinking, although sleep is a different state in the world in which we then dwell with our souls. From what I have just stated, you will see that the so-called dead are different from the so-called living, in that the so-called living sleep away what the so-called dead actually experience. The so-called living sleep away feeling and willing, which constantly stream through their being. The dead stand within this feeling and willing. It will not be difficult for you to understand that the dead dwell in the same world in which we dwell as the so-called living. We are separated from the dead merely because we do not perceive the world in which they live and weave. The dead are always around us. we are surrounded also by those beings who live without having physically incarnated. We only fail to perceive them. You need only form the conception of a human being sleeping in a room. Objects are around him, but he does not perceive them. The fact that something is not perceived is no proof that it is not there. In regard to the world of the dead, we are in exactly the same position in which we are in regard to the world of physical beings while we sleep. We live in the same world with the dead and with the higher hierarchies. They are in our midst, but we are separated from them merely through the nature of our consciousness. My dear friends, from this it follows that the human being perceives and understands only a part of that reality within which he actually exists. If the human being were to grasp full reality, his knowledge would be quite different from what it is today. This knowledge, then, would be comprised not only of the forces that come from the kingdoms of nature known to us, but also of the forces of the higher spiritual beings and the forces that come from the realm of the so-called dead. Today these facts are considered extremely grotesque by the great majority of people. Yet for ever wider circles of mankind, and especially for those whose concern it is to be interested in the evolution and progress of human life, these ideas should become a matter that must be penetrated by cognition. For right up to our time, more or less, the human being was guided by dark unknown forces in regard to all that he cannot perceive in his surroundings. Guidance by these obscure unknown forces has more or less ceased in our age. We shall have to speak about this in our next lecture. Today the human being must enter into conscious relationship with certain forces which reach over into our world from the realm of the so-called dead. It will not be easy to make human beings conscious of these things to the degree that is necessary in order to put the real, the true, in the place of the fantastic inadequateness which pervades our age and which has brought about such great catastrophes. In regard to this, I should like to draw your attention to only one point, one fact. Among the many so-called scientific courses, there are historical studies. History is taught and studied in schools. But what is this history? Any well-informed person who is acquainted with the literature of earlier times knows that what today is called the science of history is not much more than 100 years old. I do not want to say more about this. People consider and write history with the same thoughts and concepts they employ in external ordinary life when observing nature. But no one asks whether it is permissible to observe historical life in the same way one observes external nature. It is not permissible. For the historical life of mankind is governed by impulses which cannot be grasped with the concepts of our waking consciousness. Anyone who is really able to observe history knows that we are governed by impulses in historical life which for ordinary consciousness are only accessible to the dream state. Just as mankind dreams away the life of feeling, so it dreams away the impulses of history. If we attempt to observe the historical life of mankind with the concepts which are excellent for natural science, we cannot truly grasp it. We observe it only on its surface. What is it that is taught and studied as history in the schools? It is nothing more, in regard to real history, than the description of a corpse is in regard to the whole human being. History, as it is taught today, is the study of a corpse. The study of history must undergo a complete transformation. In the future it will only be possible to understand what works in history with inspired concepts, with inspiration. Then we shall have true history. Then we shall know what it is that governs mankind, what it is that works from historical life into social life. My dear friends, what I am stating here has a deep significance. People think they understand social historical life. They do not understand it, because they want to grasp it with the ordinary concepts of daily waking life. This does not become evident when history is written, for little seems to depend upon whether or not the facts are actually true. I should like to give you an example of this. We learn from history books that America was discovered in 1492. Generally speaking, this is correct, but from what is thus written in history books, we form the conception that prior to 1492, America was completely unknown, as far as we may go back in history. But this is not the case. America was unknown for only a few centuries. Still, in the 12th and 13th centuries, there existed a lively traffic between Iceland, Ireland, and America. Medical herbs and other goods were imported from Europe into Europe from America. For certain reasons, connected with the inner karma of Europe and the early role of Ireland, Rome made every possible effort to cut Europe off from America, so that America would be forgotten. This effort on the part of Rome was not detrimental to European conditions at the time. It was well meant. I only intend to show by this example that a fact need not necessarily be an historical fact, that we may be completely ignorant historically regarding an important matter. To have historical knowledge, or to be historically ignorant in regard to the social life of mankind, is, on the other hand, of great importance. How often today do we hear people say, "We must think thus and so about this or that event, because history teaches thus and so." Take modern literature, especially present-day magazines and newspapers, and you will see how often the phrase is employed. History teaches thus and so. The human being partly sleeps away the historical events, in the midst of which he lives. But he, nevertheless, forms a judgment about them, or one is inculcated in him. The phrase, "history teaches thus and so," is very frequently heard, and at the beginning of the war, important men stated what history taught them concerning the duration of the war. It was the honest conviction of the so-called clever people that according to the general social and economic conditions of the earth, the war could not last longer than from 4 to 6 months. Many have stated this. Many have prophesied. At most from 4 to 6 months. The outcome of this prophecy was similar to that of another historical prophecy, made by a much greater spirit, to be sure, but which was formed by the ordinary conceptions of everyday consciousness. Such conceptions cannot lay hold of history, because history is dreamt away, even partly slept away. It can only be grasped with great concepts. When Friedrich von Schiller became professor of philosophy at the University of Vienna, he delivered his world-famous inaugural speech about the study of history. This was shortly before the outbreak of the French Revolution. He stated his conviction, derived from history, but gained with ordinary concepts. I am not quoting literally, but the following is what Schiller, who certainly was not an insignificant personality, propounded as his conviction. History teaches that many quarrels and wars occurred in ancient times, and from what took place then, we can expect disharmony among the European peoples in the future. They will, however, consider themselves members of a great family, and will no longer tear each other to pieces. Thus Friedrich von Schiller, shortly thereafter, in 1789, the French Revolution broke out. All that befell the European family of peoples in the 19th century, and what is happening now so many years later, has certainly annihilated the so-called historical judgment of Schiller in a most thorough fashion. History will only teach us something if we are able to penetrate it with inspired concepts. For the historical life of mankind is influenced not only by the so-called living, but by the souls of the dead. by the spirits with whom the so-called dead live, just as we live with the beings of the animal, plant, and mineral realms. Mankind attaches great value to mere phrases, but it must wean itself from this habit. It can do so only if it acquires true concepts, concepts permeated with reality. A very important concept is that which shows us that we are separated from the so-called dead only through our consciousness, which is a sleeping consciousness in regard to the world of feeling and willing, in which the dead surround us. It is a sleeping consciousness, similar to the consciousness in which we dwell between falling asleep and awakening as regards the physical objects around us. Clairvoyant consciousness confirms, step by step, that which has been characterized here in general terms. The question, however, may arise: how is it that the human being knows nothing about the world in which he lives, through which he passes with every step of his life? Well, my dear friends, the very way in which clairvoyant consciousness offers concrete enlightenment concerning the intercourse with the so-called dead is the living proof of the fact that for ordinary consciousness, the world in which the dead live must remain unknown. I need only relate some of the characteristic traits of this intercourse with the so-called dead, which may take place with developed clairvoyant consciousness, and you will see from this why we know nothing in ordinary life about this intercourse with the dead. It is possible, although it is in a certain respect a very delicate matter, still it is possible that the world of the dead may lay itself open to awakened consciousness, that the world of the dead may be perceived by the human being, that he may enter into conscious relationship with the individual dead person. The human being must, however, acquire completely different consciousness if he wishes to enter into an actual and secure relation with the dead person. He must acquire a consciousness which is completely different from the one employed in the physical world. Let me describe here a few characteristic traits. In the physical world, we have certain habits in our relationship to another human being. If I speak to someone here on the physical plane, ask him something, communicate something to him, I am conscious of the fact that the speech proceeds from my soul through my speech organs and passes over to him. I am conscious of the fact that I speak. I am conscious of this fact also in regard to external perception. And if this other human being here on the physical plane answers me or communicates something to me, then I hear his words. His words sound out to me. This is not the case in fully conscious intercourse with the dead. Parenthesis, in half-conscious intercourse the matter is somewhat different, but I am speaking here of fully conscious intercourse. Close parenthesis. In fully conscious intercourse with the dead, matters are reversed. They are quite different from what we expect. When I confront the dead person, he speaks in his soul what I intend to ask him or what I wish to communicate to him. This sounds out to me from him. And what he intends to say to me sounds out of my own soul. We have to become accustomed to this, my dear friends. We must accustom ourselves to hearing what the other person says as sounding out of our own soul, and to hearing what we say as sounding out of the spiritual outer world. This is so different from everything we are accustomed to experience in the physical world that it does not occur to us at all to take any stand in regard to it. For just consider the following. At one time or another in life, something speaks within your soul. You certainly will ascribe it to yourself. The human being is in certain respects egotistical, and if something arises within his soul, he is inclined to ascribe it to his own inspiration, to his own genius. We only learn to recognize through clairvoyant consciousness that much that arises in our souls is in truth told us by the dead. The realm of the dead constantly plays into our will, into our feeling. something arises in us which we may call a good idea. In truth, it is a communication from the dead. We are also unfamiliar with the other aspect of the matter, and pay no attention to what may appear out of the grey spiritual environment, as if it were our own thoughts surrounding us. If a human being can be sufficiently objective in regard to his own thoughts, to experience them as if they were hovering around him, then the dead understand these thoughts. It is true that the human being, even in ordinary consciousness, is in connection with the dead, but he does not become aware of it, because he is not able to interpret the facts which I have just described. For we must realize that besides sleeping, waking, and dreaming, we have two other states of consciousness. We have two other extraordinarily important states of consciousness, but we pay no attention to them in ordinary life. We fail to pay attention to them for a certain reason, which you will appreciate at once when I name these two states of consciousness. We have the state of falling asleep and the state of waking up. They are of short duration and pass so quickly that we pay no attention to their content. But the most important things occur at the moment of falling asleep and the moment of waking up. If we learn to know the real nature of these two moments, we shall, in a certain respect, acquire the right concepts concerning the relationship of the human being to the world in which the dead coexist with us. Man is constantly in connection with the world of the dead, and this connection is especially vivid at the moment of falling asleep and the moment of waking up. Clairvoyant consciousness shows that at the moment of falling asleep, the human being is especially fitted to ask questions of the dead, give information to the dead, in general to turn to the dead. At the moment of waking up, the human being is especially fitted to receive communications, messages from the dead. He receives them rapidly, and since he wakes up directly afterward, they pass him by quickly, and the tumult of waking life drowns them out. Not so long ago, more primitive people, in their atavistic state, knew these facts, and they hinted at them. But under the influence of our materialistic culture, such things perish, even in remote regions. Anyone who grew up among the old peasants in rural districts knows that one of their fundamental rules was that on awaking in the morning one should remain quiet for a moment and refrain from looking out of the windows into the light. These people tried to protect what worked upon the soul at the moment of waking from the rush and turmoil of waking life. They tried to remain quiet for a moment in their darkened room and not look out of the window immediately on awaking. It is not too difficult to observe that the moments of waking up and of falling asleep are of a quite special character. But in order to become aware of such things, we need a certain wakefulness of thinking. Wakefulness of thinking is a faculty which has never been lacking to such an extent as it is today. I could give you grotesque examples of this. Let me quote one of the banal examples that permeate everyday life and can be met at every turn, as it were. A few days ago I noticed an advertisement in a newspaper which filled about 1/8 of the page. It advertised the widespread memory course of a man called Pullman. It stated that only by employing the method of Herr Pullman was it possible to gain influence over other people. No other method would do. I am not speaking now about whether it is permissible or not, whether it is right or wrong to try to gain influence over other people. This does not concern us at the moment. I am drawing your attention to the form of the advertisement. It stated certain people pretend to be able to gain influence over others by means of personal magnetism or by strengthening this or that force in human nature. It can easily be proved that these people do not speak the truth, for not one will be able to say that he succeeded through his personal influence in making Mr. Rothschild or any other rich man give him $1 million. Since it is a proven fact that this did not occur, and it certainly would have been tried had there been a chance of success, It is also a proven fact that no influence may be gained over people by this method. Influence may only be gained on the path of science and education. And then the method of Pullman is described. Now we know that quite a number of people will become convinced through this advertisement that all other methods of trying to influence people are useless, for has it not been proved that they were unable to influence Mr. Rothschild to give them his millions? But how many people are there, you may ask yourselves, who read this advertisement and at once raise the objection? Does this Pullman have students who succeeded in gaining Rothschild's millions? You need only ask yourselves to how many people this obvious thought will occur. This is a trivial example, but an example which shows you how thinking fails to wake up in regard to what we read. I have chosen this example first because of its everyday character, and secondly because it goes without saying that among those present there is nobody who would fail to observe that even this Pullman did not succeed in getting the millions. It is a foregone conclusion that all those who would be taken in by such an advertisement are not present here, and out of politeness I do not mention an example which could appeal to any of my present hearers. But what I want to say is that from morning to night people read these things. It occurs in countless instances. They say, "We pay no attention to them." Is that really so? The other day I read a speech in which the following sentence occurred. Quote, "Our relationship with a certain country is the core which must give the direction to our politics in the future." Close quote. Just imagine the construction of this thought. A relationship is a core which becomes a direction. People who think like this are in a position to do all kinds of things in life. But we do not notice the connections that exist between such crippled thinking and the public life. It is necessary today to pay attention to this lack of wakefulness in thinking, which is a mark of our culture. To have thoughts that can be carried out. This is the first demand if we wish to become aware of the revelations of the moments of going to sleep and of awakening. I once listened to an address by a very famous professor of literature and history. It was his inaugural address, and he tried his best. He formulated all kinds of literary historical questions, and at the conclusion he said, "You see, gentlemen, I have led you into a forest of question marks." I pictured it to myself, a forest of question marks? Just think, a forest of question marks. Only he who is accustomed to carrying through the concepts which arise in him, that is, he who develops wakefulness in his thinking, is prepared to pay attention to such things as the moments of waking up and falling asleep. However, even though something is not perceived, it nevertheless exists. And the intercourse between the human being and the dead exists, and is especially strong at the moment of falling asleep and at the moment of waking up. In reality, every human being poses countless questions and gives information to his beloved dead at the moment of falling asleep, and receives messages and answers from them at the moment of waking up. This intercourse with the dead, however, may be cultivated in a certain way. We have previously described several ways of cultivating it. Today we shall add the following. There is a certain difference in regard to the thoughts which will lead us to a relation with a dead person at the moment of falling asleep. Not every thought is equally suitable. Anyone who does not merely lead a sensual, egotistical life will, out of a healthy feeling, have the longing not to interrupt the relation which karma has brought him with certain personalities who have now passed through the portal of death. He certainly will frequently connect his thoughts with these personalities. And the thoughts which we connect with our conception of the departed personalities may produce an actual intercourse with the dead, even though we are unable to pay attention to what happens at the moment of falling asleep. Certain thoughts, however, are more favorable than others for such an intercourse. Abstract thoughts, thoughts which we form with a certain indifference, even perhaps only from a sense of duty, are little suited to pass over to the dead at the moment of falling asleep. But thoughts, concepts which arise from the experience of a special interest which united us in life are well suited to pass over to the dead. If we remember the dead person in such a way that we do not merely think of him with abstract thoughts and cold concepts, but recall a moment when we grew warm at his side, when he told us something dear to our heart. If we remember the moments we have lived through with him in a community of feeling and in a community of willing, if we remember the times we undertook and decided something together which we both valued and which led us to a common action, in short, something which made our hearts beat as one, if we recall vividly this mutual beating of our hearts, then all this colors our thought of the departed one, so it is able to stream over to him at our next moment of falling asleep. It does not matter whether we have this thought at 9 in the morning, at noon, or at 2 in the afternoon. We may have it at any time during the day. It will remain and stream over to the dead person at the moment of our falling asleep. At the moment of waking up, we may in turn receive answers, messages from the departed one. It does not necessarily have to be at the moment of waking up that this arises in our soul, since we may be unable to pay attention to it then. But in the course of the day something may arise in our soul in the form of a good idea, an inspiration, we might say, if we believe in such things. But also in regard to this, certain conditions are more favorable, others less so. Under certain conditions, it is easier for the dead to find access to our soul. The conditions are favorable if we have acquired a clear conception of the being of the departed one, if we were so deeply interested in his being that it really stood before our spiritual eye, EYE. You will ask, why does he say that? If someone was close to us, we certainly have a conception of his being. I do not believe this at all, my dear friends. People pass one another in our time and know each other very, very little. This may not alienate us from the other being here in the physical world, but it alienates us from the being who dwells in the world of the dead. Here in the physical world, there are numerous unconscious and subconscious forces and impulses which bring people close to one another, even though they do not want to learn to know each other. It is supposed to happen in life, as some of you probably have read, that people may be married for decades and yet have very little knowledge of one another. In such cases, the impulses which bring these people together do not rest upon mutual knowledge. Life is permeated everywhere by subconscious or unconscious impulses. These subconscious impulses bind us together here on earth, but they do not bind us to the being who has passed through death before us. In order to effect such a connection, it is necessary that we have received into our soul something through which the being of the departed one lives vividly in us. And the more vividly it lives in us, the easier it is for that being to have access to our soul. The easier it is for him to communicate with us. This is what I wanted to tell you about the intercourse constantly occurring between the so-called living and the so-called dead. Every one of us is in constant intercourse with the so-called dead. But the reason we do not know it is that we are unable to observe sufficiently the moment of falling asleep, the moment of waking up. I have told you all this in order to give a more concrete form to your connection with the supersensible world in which the dead dwell. This connection will take on a still more definite shape if we consider the following relationships. The young die and the old die. The death of younger people is different from the death of older people in its relation to the living human beings they leave behind. Such things can only be discussed if it is possible to focus one's attention upon definite individual conditions in this field. I describe this not out of a general knowledge, but as a summary of what has actually occurred in definite individual cases. If clairvoyant consciousness observes what happens when children die, when young people leave their parents and family and pass through the portal of death. And if one learns to know how these souls live on, the knowledge which thus arises may be summarized in the following words. The consciousness of these young people that have passed through the gate of death may be characterized by saying that they are not lost to the living. They remain here. They remain in the neighborhood, in the being of those they have left behind. For a long time these young people do not separate from those they have left behind. They remain within their sphere. The matter is different in the case of older people that have died. It is easiest to express these things epigrammatically. The souls of these human beings who have died in the later years of their lives do not lose on their part the souls of those who have stayed behind. Thus, while those who have remained behind do not lose the younger souls, the older people, after having passed through death's door, do not lose the souls of the living, in spite of the latter's being here on earth. They take along with them, as it were, what they wish to have from us. It is easy for them to do so, while the souls of younger people can have what they need from us only if they remain more or less within the sphere of the survivors. And this is just what they do. It is possible to study these relationships in a way that will ascertain the facts as I have just described. The study will, of course, have to be carried out with clairvoyant consciousness. If clairvoyant consciousness studies grief and the pain of separation, it will find that these are two completely different states. Human beings do not know this, but if one observes the grief, the sorrow in the soul of a person over a deceased child, one will find it is something quite different from the grief and sorrow which may be observed if an older person has died. Although human beings do not know it, these inner soul states are fundamentally different. It is a strange fact. If parents mourn a child that has died at an early age, this mourning, as to its actual content and deeper impulse, is only a reflection in the soul of the parents of what the child experiences. The child has remained here, and what he feels penetrates into the souls of those who mourn him, calling forth an impulse. It is a pain of compassion. It is in reality the pain or sorrow of the child himself, which the parents experience. Of course, they ascribe it to themselves, but it is a compassionate grief. Do not misunderstand me, my dear friends. We must take the expression I am going to use in a reasonable sense, without attaching to it any secondary meaning. We might say, if a young person dies, we are possessed by the pain from the departed one's soul life. We are possessed in a normal fashion, which is not detrimental. He lives on in us, and what expresses itself as pain is his life in us. It is different when we mourn an older person who has left us. There a pain appears which is not the reflection of what lives in the departed one, for he is really able to receive what lives in our soul. He himself does not lose us. It is impossible for us to be possessed by his pain, by his feelings, for he has no longing to penetrate us with his feelings, because he draws us after him. He does not lose us. Therefore this pain, this mourning, is an egotistical pain, an egotistical mourning. This is not meant as a reproof, for such pain and mourning are justified, but it is necessary to differentiate between the two kinds of mourning. After having thus spoken about mourning our departed ones and the way we continue to live with them, let us now proceed in our considerations to the dead themselves. Since the relation to a person that had died in youth is so different from the relation to a person that departed later in life, you will readily understand that there must be a difference in the way of commemorating them. In regard to a child, we shall choose the right ritual, the right commemoration. We shall bear him in our memory in the right way, if we take into consideration that the child has remained with us, that he lives with us, and that he loves to become familiar with that which we would have been able to impart to him had he lived. Experience shows that children after their death long to find in the commemoration which we offer them general human relationships. They long to find in the funeral service that which is of general interest and has little to do with special interests. Therefore, the Roman Catholic funeral service is most suitable for children. It is a general ritual, valid for everyone in the same way. A child that has died would like to have a funeral service that is of a general human character, valid for everyone, and not for him alone. The Protestant funeral service, during which a speech is made, entering upon the special individual life relationships of the departed one, is most suitable for the commemoration of an older person who has died. And if we wish to foster the memory of an older departed person, it is best to cling to details of his life which were characteristic of him, and to look in his special individual life for the thought with which we celebrate his memory. From this you see, my dear friends, that properly considered, spiritual science cannot remain mere theory. It shows us something of the relationships which exist in the world, from which we are separated merely through the fact that we dream away our feelings and sleep away our will impulses. It speaks of the worlds within which we exist with feeling and will. If we take hold of spiritual scientific thoughts with sufficient intensity, with proper energy, they will not remain thoughts, but will act upon feeling and will. Just imagine the fruitful effect of these ideas upon life. Clergymen who do not adhere to mere abstract theology will be helped by these ideas in conducting funeral services in the proper way and with the proper tact. This is not surprising, for the world of which spiritual science speaks is the real world in which our feelings and our will impulses live. Thus what spiritual science is able to give works in turn upon feeling and will. It works upon feeling if we develop our feelings in regard to the dead, but it must also work upon the will impulses. We should pay special attention to this in our time. For, my dear friends, if we were to trace the will impulses of the human beings of the present day, we would not come upon very deep regions of the human soul. It is imperative today that men look for spiritual impulses for their willing. And it is tragic that up to the present day they are not resolved to do so. The troubles of our time will only find a solution if human beings are willing to search for spiritual impulses for their external life. As I have already said, people still reject this, but they will have to learn it, for this age will become the great taskmaster for the generation that must live through it, the taskmaster to a much greater degree than has been the case so far. We shall link our next lecture to the concepts I offered to you today, which were concerned with the individual personal element, and shall then speak about the conditions of our present age from a truly spiritual scientific viewpoint. It will be my task today to proceed in our spiritual observations from the foundations which we laid here the last time to such spiritual processes which lie immediately behind the events of our age that speak so seriously to our souls. If we live, in the sense of our spiritual science, with the forces that stream from the so-called dead into the realm in which we dwell during our incarnation, it is possible to observe with great vividness what it is spiritually that underlies such a difficult time. To be sure, people of the present age have little longing to know the spiritual background of existence. Such lack of interest is closely connected with the fact that this great catastrophe has befallen mankind in the present age. I have drawn your attention to the fact that in the last third of the 19th century, in contrast to earlier periods of time, great changes took place in human evolution. I have repeatedly pointed to the end of the 70s of the last century, and have shown that the end of the 70s was an incisive moment in the evolution of mankind. Very few people of the present time are aware of the fundamental difference in the spiritual life since the end of the 70s, as compared to the spiritual life that preceded it. Human beings lack the perspective to see this, for such a thing only becomes apparent if one is able to observe the differences from a certain distance. If mankind is not to expect still greater misery, this perspective must be gained as soon as possible. For, my dear friends, our present age is governed by a strange and very vivid contradiction. I shall describe this contradiction to you, and you will find it very grotesque. There is no time within historical human evolution that is so spiritual as the time in which we live, the time since the end of the 70s. From an historical point of view, we live in the most spiritual of times. Still, it is an undeniable fact that people who consider themselves spiritually developed believe that our time is completely materialistic. As far as life is concerned, our time is not materialistic, but as far as the belief of many people and its results are concerned, our time is certainly materialistic. What do we really mean if we say, quote, "Ours is a spiritual time," close quote? Well, my dear friends, consider the natural scientific world conception of the present day. Compared to it, the natural scientific world conception of the past is materialistic. Today, we have a natural scientific world conception which rises to the most subtle, the most spiritualized concepts. We see this if we observe existence beyond the immediate physical present. Most spiritual conceptions today, although well meant, mean very little to the so-called dead. But the natural scientific conceptions of the present age, if reflected upon without prejudice, mean extraordinarily much to them. It is an interesting fact that so-called materialistic Darwinism is conceived of and employed in a completely spiritual fashion in the realm of the dead. In full life, things appear quite different from the way they appear in the frequently erroneous belief produced by what people experience in the body. What do I really mean by pointing to the natural scientifically spiritual? Well, in order to be able to form these concepts, to rise to such thoughts as are developed today in regard to evolution and so forth, a spirituality is needed which did not exist in previous ages. It is much easier to see ghosts and to take them for something spiritual than to form sharply defined concepts for that which seems to be only material. This has brought about the fact that human beings develop in their soul life the most spiritualized concepts and then proceed to deny them. These spiritualized concepts are mistakenly believed to relate only to material things. The materialistic interpretation of the present natural scientific world conception is nothing but a denial of its true character. It has sprung from a tendency to cowardice, pure cowardice. One cannot bring oneself to live with one's feelings in these spiritualized concepts, and to grasp this spirituality in the rarefaction needed for the forming of clear-cut concepts about nature. One does not dare to acknowledge that one lives in the spirit when one develops these rarefied, spiritualized concepts. One deceives oneself by saying, "These concepts relate merely to material things." For this is not true. It is mere self-deception. The same holds good for other spheres of life. As I pointed out to you the day before yesterday, many artistic creations of the present time show values through this spiritualized, refined feeling, which did not exist in the art development of earlier epochs. This change in the spiritual life has been brought about through a quite definite spiritual event, which I should like to characterize today from a certain point of view. At the beginning of the 40s of the 19th century, when the middle of that century had not quite been reached, the Archangel Michael gradually rose from the rank of an archangel to that of a time spirit. He began at that time to undergo an evolution, which enabled him to work into human life not merely from the super-earthly standpoint, but directly from the standpoint of the earthly. He had to prepare himself to descend to the earth itself, to emulate, as it were, the great procedure of the Christ Jesus himself, to take his starting point here upon the earth, and to be active henceforth from the point of view of the earth. From the 40s to the end of the 70s of the last century, this spiritual being prepared himself for this task. Thus it may be observed that the period between the 40s and the year 1879 presents a significant battle in that super-earthly sphere which borders immediately on the earthly sphere. This spiritual being, whom we call the Archangel Michael, had to fight a hard battle against certain opposing spirits. If we wish to understand what actually happened there, we must consider these opposing spirits. These spiritual beings, who had to be fought by the Archangel Michael, becoming a time spirit, have always affected the life and evolution of mankind. During the past millennia, prior to the middle of the 19th century, their task in the spiritual world was to create differentiation among human beings. Those spiritual beings who are the direct followers of the archangels strive to lead human beings back to the group soul, to spread uniformity over the whole of mankind. If these beings alone had been active, mankind would have become one indistinguishable species, similar to the animal species, but on a somewhat higher level. These spiritual beings, however, against whom the Michaelic principle had to fight, had the task of spreading differentiation among mankind, to split humanity into races and peoples, to bring about all those differences that are connected with the blood and with the nerve temperament. This had to happen. They may be called Ahrimanic beings, and we must realize that the Ahrimanic principle was a necessity in the course of mankind's evolution. Now a time of great significance arrived in the evolution of mankind, beginning with the 40s of the 19th century. The time arrived when the old differentiations had to vanish, when the divided human race had to be formed into a unity. You see, the cosmopolitan views, which, to be sure, sometimes turned into cosmopolitan slogans in the 18th and the first half of the 19th century, are simply a reflection of what occurred in the spiritual world. The tendency exists in mankind to wipe out the various differences which were fostered by the blood and the nerve temperament. It is not a tendency of the spiritual worlds to create further differences among mankind, but it is a tendency of the spiritual worlds to pour a cosmopolitan element over mankind. Although, under the impressions of our catastrophic times, people have little understanding for this, still it has to be stated as a true fact. If this fact, mirrored in the earthly events, is observed in its spiritual background, clairvoyant vision shows that it was the spirit who was to become the time spirit of the modern age that formed the 40s onward, fought against the race spirits, the folk spirits, that produced the difference between peoples. What has always been represented by a significant symbol took place here, although at a different stage. The symbol refers also to other stages of evolution, for matters repeat themselves at various stages, and what I am telling you now is only a repetition at a certain stage of a spiritual event that took place at other stages. It is the event that is represented by the symbol of the conquering of the dragon by the Archangel Michael. This conquering of the dragon by the Archangel Michael, which means that the counter-striving powers have been cast out of the realm in which the Archangel Michael rules, took place in a certain sphere, beginning with the 40s of the last century. Certain spiritual beings, whose task in the spiritual world it was to divide mankind into races and peoples, were cast out of heaven down upon the earth. These spiritual beings, who up to the 40s produced these differentiations among mankind, have no longer any power in the region bordering the earthly world. They have been cast down among men upon the earth with everything they could bring with them. This is what spiritual science designates as the victory of the Archangel Michael over the counter-striving spirits, which took place at the end of the 70s, the pushing down upon the earth of certain spirits resisting him. Thus, since the end of the 70s, since 1879, we have two things. We have on earth, for those who may be said to be of good will, if we understand the expression in a qualified sense, the rulership of the time spirit Michael, who enables us to acquire spiritualized concepts, a spiritualized intellectual life. We also have on earth the counter-striving spirits who deceive us into denying the spirituality of the present time. If we fight against the materialism of our time, we should be constantly aware of the fact that we must not fight against what is good in our age, but against the lies of our age. For the spirits that have been pushed out of heaven down upon the earth are chiefly spirits of falsehood, who as spirits of hindrance prevent us from looking for the spiritual in our grasp of natural existence. If one learns to know those human beings who descended to earthly incarnation from the spiritual world after the year 1841, and who have died since, one can indeed see how these things are considered from the other side, as it were. One is then in a position to correct much of that which, here in the physical world, is very difficult to see through. You see, at the beginning of the 20th century, it gradually became apparent how necessary it is to point again to the most varied fields of spirit in life. And those who drew attention to this fact were the human beings who, after the year 1848, more precisely after 1840, had participated in the hard battle which was carried on by the Archangel Michael in the spiritual world, and which ended in 1879 with the casting down of the counter-striving spirits into the life of the earth, where they now are among human beings. One participates in the battle of the Archangel Michael if one rises against these spirits and tries to drive them from the field. Now, there exists a certain law which states that from every point in world history, evolution may be traced in two directions, backward as well as forward. If we focus our attention on any point in the historical development of mankind, we may say, at this point of time, this or that happened. Now, as time goes on, the events may be observed, but time may also be observed retrospectively. We may go back from 1879 to 1878, 77, 60, 50, and so on, and may then observe the spiritual world in retrospect. The following then presents itself. In the deeper structure of events as they proceed, we may discover a repetition of what preceded them. If one expresses something great in a simple way, it may easily sound trivial, but I shall speak simply. If we consider the year 1879, we can proceed to 1880, or we can go back to 1878. If we proceed to 1880, we shall observe in the deeper spiritual structure of that year that what has happened in 1878 is still active within it. Behind the events of 1880, there stand as active forces the events of 1878. And behind the events of 1881, there stand as active forces the events of 1877. As we go back, it is as if the line of time reversed itself, and the events which lie back at a certain point of time placed themselves behind the events which lie ahead of that point of time. Much can be understood if we grasp these things. Now, I beg you to remember that I have for many years spoken about the year 1879, and not only since 1914, which would be cheap. This is important, my dear friends, and I ask you now to make a simple calculation with me. Count back from the year 1879. Count back to the year which I have often designated as the other boundary. I have always stated that the battle of which I am now speaking started at the beginning of the 40s, around 1840, 1841. Count back 1879, 1870, 69, 1859, 1849, and 8 or 9 years more. This is 38 or 39 years. Now count forward 1879, 89, 99, 1909, 1914, and right up into our days, 1918. And you also have 38 or 39 years. If you observe the year 1917, you will find a surprising result. You will realize the deep significance of the occultist's statement that in starting from an incisive historical event, you will find the preceding spiritual event repeated in the subsequent one. Behind the earthly events of our days, there stand the spiritual events that began in the 40s and which we designate as the Archangel Michael's battle against the counter-striving spirits. These events stand behind present-day events. We have a repetition today of what took place at the beginning of the 40s. You can imagine how differently one looks at the events of our time if one pays attention to this law. One will develop a deeper understanding of events that now pass unnoticed, that do not penetrate into one's soul. One will realize that the battle of the Archangel Michael against the counter-striving powers has to a certain degree returned to its starting point. It is in general very difficult to speak to human beings of the present day about these deeper relationships, because they violently reject that which would help them to understand the present time and enable them to act in the proper manner. It is necessary today to rid ourselves of old prejudices and consciously to understand the facts. For things happen here on the physical plane which are of a much more spiritual nature than events in general. This is connected with the descent of the Archangel Michael into our earth region. Many people speak of this descent, but if they are seriously called upon to take this fact on its true background, then they do not follow. They do not want to follow. Yet it is extremely necessary that a spiritual understanding of the most important impulses of our age lay hold of ever more extended circles of our contemporaries. Therefore it was very important, during all these years of our group meetings, to draw attention to the necessity of not sleeping away the stream of events which in our time is so strongly influenced by the Spirit. For to sleep away events is a characteristic trait of our time. People pass by the events as though asleep, and it can be said that the more incisive, the more significant an event is that enters the physical plane, the more human beings sleep through it. The events of March 1917, if I may indicate a concrete fact, were of tremendous significance and will produce results of such great importance of which mankind does not even dream today. And it is really unbelievable how little understanding exists among people for the necessity of a complete revision of their judgments, of a complete revision of all that people have believed prior to 1914. On this occasion I may perhaps be permitted to point to the fact that in 1910 I delivered a number of lectures in Christiania, now called Oslo, about the European folk souls. In the first of these lectures, you may read that human beings will soon be called upon to understand something about the relations of the European folk souls. The following has been repeatedly emphasized in our lectures. Turn your gaze toward the immediate East. What happens there is important for human evolution. How often has this been said? Every one of my listeners has heard it. And in the spring of 1914, in my Vienna lecture cycle about the life between death and a new birth, I dared to make the emphatic statement that the social life of our time may be compared with a special form of disease, namely with a carcinoma. I stated that a creeping cancerous disease permeates social life. Naturally, my dear friends, under our present conditions, these things cannot be stated in another form, but they must be understood. We must not think of world events following one another in continuous progression, as historians imagine. They believe that the later event develops out of the preceding one, which has in turn developed out of the one preceding it, and so forth. The prejudice which maintains that the later must develop in the most tranquil fashion out of what preceded it, we may leave to those who do not have the sense for reality, which is expected of the anthroposophist. We may leave this prejudice to the politicians. Reality, however, is quite different. We must think of the course of events as of a pair of scales in full motion, the scale beam descending first on the right side and then on the left. Therefore, the time since the beginning of the 40s may be characterized as follows. Great possibilities existed, if only the attempt had been made during the period from 1840 to 1914. The year 1879 divides this period into two parts, to prepare in an adequate manner the spiritualization of mankind which is striven for by the Archangel Michael. If the attempt had been made on a larger scale to imbue mankind with spiritual concepts, spiritual ideas. Mankind, however, must depend in our age on its own free will. And if out of its own free volition mankind fails to grasp such possibilities, then the scale beam sinks to the other side. What could have been reached on the spiritual path is now discharged through the blood. What we experience in our catastrophic times is an equalizing of the scales. Mankind who has rejected spiritualization must be forced to accept it. This can happen through a physical catastrophe. This idea may be verified if we place ourselves upon the following firm foundation. We live here in this physical world, but we are awake in this physical world only through our perceptions and our concepts, as I described the day before yesterday. We dream with our feelings and sleep with our will impulses. This is a matter of course for man. But if we familiarize ourselves through imagination, inspiration, and intuition with the spiritual world, which is always around us like the air, and in which the so-called dead exist, together with us, in which their impulses are active, then we perceive how life, here in the physical world, is connected with the life of the so-called dead. The dead are able to receive from human hearts only spiritual thoughts. Recall what I told you the day before yesterday. I said if a human being dies in his youth, he has in a spiritual sense not actually left his family. He has in reality remained here. Something of great importance to the dead is connected with this, and I beg you to take this very seriously. For the departed one it is not merely a question of being here. For him it is a question of being able to bear this existence. If the dead person is present in a materialistically inclined family, which does not cultivate spiritual thoughts, he is constantly oppressed and distressed. The family constitutes a nightmare for him, comparable to the nightmare we experience when we inhale too great an amount of air. Only spiritual thoughts among those with whom he has remained can rid him of this nightmare and make life among them bearable for the departed one. And again I told you, if an older person is torn from his family, he takes their souls with him in a certain respect. He draws them after him. But if they are not permeated by spiritual thoughts, they likewise constitute a nightmare for him. Now let us consider the following. We can learn a great deal if we observe the sudden death of a human being caused by outer or abnormal inner conditions. Let us say a human being is slain or shot. In such an instance, death is brought about in a way which is very different from gradual death through illness. Imagine the following case. A human being is shot in his 35th year. His life is destroyed through outer circumstances. If the bullet had not struck him, certainly there are karmic connections, but what I am going to say nevertheless holds good. This human being's constitution might have enabled him to live another 35 years. He bears within him the constitution for another 35 years. This now produces a quite definite effect. My dear friends, if a human being dies by violence when his life forces are still very active, he has tremendously significant experiences at the moment of death. Condensed into one moment, he experiences things which would have been spread over long periods of time. What he could have experienced during the next 35 years, he now experiences in one single moment. For the important experience in the hour of death is the following. The human being sees in truth his body from outside. He sees the transition it passes through. He sees that it relinquishes the control of the forces it possessed when the soul dwelt in the body, and that it now becomes a nature being, given over to the nature forces, to the external physical forces. The tremendously significant experience at the moment of death is that the human being then beholds the relinquishing of his organism to the physical nature forces. If a human being suffers a violent death, he is suddenly delivered not only to the normal nature forces, but his organism is treated by the bullet shot as if it were an inorganic, lifeless body. It is completely relegated to the inorganic world. There is a great difference between a slow death through illness and a sudden death through the interference of the external world with the human organism, be it in the form of a bullet or in any other form. In this moment there is a sudden flaring up, a sudden flashing forth of a tremendous amount of spirituality. The flaming up of a spiritual aura takes place, and the one who has passed through the portal of death looks back upon this flaming up. This flaming up greatly resembles the event that takes place only when human beings devote themselves to spiritual concepts. These are values, my dear friends, which are interchangeable. It is extremely interesting to see the following similarity. The departed one perceives from the other side the sentient thought which arises in a person when he enjoys or creates an image, a painting that is born out of spiritual life. The departed one then sees how similar this sentient thought seen from the beyond is to the sensation a person has, who is of course unconscious of this, when he suffers an external injury, let us say, to his arm, and pain arises from it. There is a great relationship between the two events. One may take the place of the other. Now you will grasp the karmic connection between the two events. Naturally, quite a number of people knew the, quote, aspect of the stars, close quote, when the 40s of the last century approached. If occultists wish to designate such an event as the battle of the Archangel Michael with the dragon, they do so by using the technical expression, quote, this is the aspect of the stars, close quote. There existed, at that time, quite a number of people who knew that such a significant event was taking place. There were some who wanted to take precaution, but one of the scales of the balance was too heavily weighted. The materialistic inclination was too strong. Thus the worst measures possible were resorted to. People who understand the signs of the times were fully aware of the fact that spiritual life must enter mankind. If this spiritual life had entered mankind from the beginning of the 40s onward, mankind would have been spared many catastrophes. For what took place would have been spared many catastrophes. For what took place would have taken place, but in another form. What is karmically necessary happens, but it may occur in various forms. This must always be kept in mind. I shall express myself more explicitly. There are two ways of thinking about what ought to happen in the social sphere or any other field. We may present a program, may form programmatical concepts. We can think out how the world should develop to a certain field, in a certain field. This can be presented in beautiful words. We can swear by these words, take them as dogmas, but nothing will result from them, nothing at all. We might have the most beautiful ideas about what ought to happen, but nothing will come of them. Ideas, however beautiful, need not result in anything. Thought-out programs are the most worthless things in life. In contrast to this, we can do something else, and many a person does it without any special clairvoyance. We may, simply through a naive, intuitive knowledge of the condition of the times, ask ourselves, what is bound to happen in the next 20 or 30 years? What is it that in our time wishes to become reality? Then, if one has discovered what will inevitably happen, one can say to oneself, now we can choose. People can either come to their senses and guide the course of events in the direction it must take in any case, then matters will turn out well. Or they can fail to do this by being asleep, and simply allowing matters to run their course, in which case that which must take place will be brought about by catastrophes, revolutions, and cataclysms. No statistics, no programs, however well thought out, are of any value. Only the observation of what wills to appear out of the hidden depths of the times is of value. This must be taken up into our consciousness. By this the intentions of the present must be governed. In the 40s of the last century, the many people who adhered to programs have won the victory over the few who understood what I have just stated. From this sprang all kinds of attempts to spiritualize mankind. Spiritism, spiritualism, for instance, is one of them. It is an attempt to spiritualize and reform mankind with inadequate means, to reveal the spiritual worlds materialistically. Even our thinking may be materialistic. It is a materialistic thought that says, this or that particular group of mankind is in the right. Why do the spiritual powers not intervene and help them vindicate their rights? How often do we hear people say today, why do the spiritual powers not intervene? The day before yesterday I gave an answer to this in a more abstract form. Mankind today must rely on its own freedom. Those who ask, why do the spiritual powers not intervene, proceed from the assumption that ghosts instead of men should make politics. That would certainly be easy progress if ghosts instead of human beings were to introduce the necessary reforms. This, of course, they do not do, because human beings must rely on their freedom. The expectation of help from ghosts is what most decidedly confounds human beings. It draws their attention away from what ought to happen. Thus the period in the life of mankind in which refined spiritual concepts were gradually developed was precisely the time when mankind was exposed to the strongest materialistic temptations. Human beings simply are unable to distinguish between refined spiritualized concepts and sensations on the one hand, and that which, on the other hand, approaches them as temptation and counteracts the grasping of the spiritualized element within them. Therefore, Because people did not comprehend at the right time how evolution must proceed, our catastrophic age, our present difficult times, have become a necessity. Without the present hard experiences, mankind would have sunk still deeper into doubt of itself. To be sure, it would have developed spirituality, but it would have rejected it to a still greater degree. This is part of the background of historical development. I should like very much indeed to throw light from this background upon much that lies in the foreground, but you will appreciate the reasons why this cannot be done in our present age. I must leave it to the individual to illuminate for himself what lives in our immediate present, seen from the background as I have just described. You see, my dear friends, the sleeping away of events which I have characterized causes an inward overlooking of the sharp angles and contours of life. But if we overlook the sharp angles and contours of life, compromises arise. Now there may be times which are suitable for compromises. The time that preceded the 40s of the 19th century was one, but this is not true of our time. Our time demands that we see things as they are, with all their angles and contours, in sharp relief. But it also arouses in the human soul the urge, just because of the presence of these sharp angles and contours, to close its eyes sleepily to them. What I have just stated may be observed even in regard to the greatest, the most significant events in human evolution. In regard to the greatest event in world history, human evolution has brought about just these angles and contours. Indeed, even in regard to the greatest event of world history, namely the mystery of Golgotha. We know all the observations made in the course of the theological development of the 19th century concerning the mystery of Golgotha. From the time Lessing began to speak about the mystery of Golgotha, right up to the time of the theologian Drews, all kinds of statements have been made regarding it. And it may well be said that the whole theological development of the 19th century offers complete proof of the fact that people have entirely forgotten how to understand the mystery of Golgotha. But there are some very interesting publications concerning the Christ Jesus. Very interesting publications indeed. Take, for instance, a Danish one. Footnote, Emil Rasmussen, Jesus, a Comparative Psychopathological Study, end of footnote. This Danish publication is written entirely from the standpoint of the modern natural scientific thinker. The author states, I am a psychologist, a physiologist, and a psychiatrist. I observe the Gospels from this standpoint. And at what conclusion does he arrive? Quite factually, in the sense of modern psychiatric judgment, he arrives at the following one. The picture which the Gospels sketch of the Christ Jesus is a pathological one. We can only conceive of the Christ Jesus as a person suffering from insanity, epilepsy, morbid visions, and similar conditions. He possesses all the symptoms of a serious mental illness. If one reads the most important passage of this book to people, as I have recently done, they are shocked. This is comprehensible, for if what they consider sacred is described as a pathological case, people are horrified. But what are the real facts in the matter? My dear friends, the facts are as follows. Among the great number of dishonest compromisers, one arose who takes his stand completely upon the natural scientific viewpoint. He makes no compromises whatsoever, but states, I am a scientist, therefore I must speak as I do. For these are the facts. If people would place themselves honestly upon the standpoint of natural science, they would have to hold such views. There are these sharp angles and contours from which they cannot escape. They cannot escape unless they forsake the natural scientific standpoint and go over to the spiritual scientific standpoint. Then they are obliged to observe matters without compromising, in the way of such a scientist, who, although entirely honest in his field, is thoroughly limited in his views, and does not try to conceal his limitations. He is thoroughly limited, but consistent. This has to be understood. If people would see today what must of necessity result If certain things are consistently carried through, they would see life without compromise. Someone recently handed me an interesting slip of paper, mentioning a book that is already known to me, but since I do not have it with me here, I can only read you what is written on this slip of paper. It was handed to me in order to show me what things are possible today. Quote, "Anyone who has attended high school will remember the unforgettable hours when he had to enjoy in his studies of Plato the conversations of Socrates with his friends. Unforgettable because of the fabulous boredom which was engendered by these conversations. He will perhaps remember that these conversations of Socrates struck him as extremely stupid. But of course he did not dare utter this opinion, for after all the man in question was Socrates, the greatest philosopher. Alexander Moskowski's book Socrates the Idiot, published by Heisler and Company, Berlin, completely does away with the unjustified overestimation of the good Athenian. In this small, entertainingly written book, the historian Moskowski undertakes to divest Socrates thoroughly of his philosophical honors. The title, Socrates the Idiot, is to be taken literally. We shall not go wrong in assuming that this book will call forth scientific discussions." Close quote. Now, you will think it dreadful that such things are written, but I do not find it dreadful at all. I think it is self-evident and quite honest of Moskowski, for according to his concepts and sentiments, he cannot do otherwise, if he wishes to remain consistent, than to call Socrates an idiot. In doing so, he is more honest than many others, who, in keeping with their views, should call Socrates an idiot too, but who prefer to make compromises instead. I do not need to say, my dear friends, that you should not go out now and spread the news that I am in agreement with Moskowski when he declares Socrates to have been an idiot. I hope that you understand what I really mean. But I must acknowledge the fact that people arrive at certain judgments in our time because they make dishonest compromises. It is impossible to think about soul pathology, as modern psychiatrists do, and not write a book such as that by the Danish author concerning the Christ Jesus. It cannot be done. One is dishonest if one does not either reject these concepts and replace them by spiritual concepts, or take the standpoint that the Christ Jesus was a mental case. If one is acquainted with the views of such people, if one knows Moskowski's opinion concerning the whole structure of the universe, his peculiar views about the theory of radiation and the theory of the quantum, one can appreciate why he, if he wishes to remain honest and consistent, must consider Socrates and also Plato idiots. What is especially necessary for mankind is the rejection of compromises. Human beings should not make compromises, at least not within their souls. It is very important to consider this as a demand of our age, for it belongs among the most significant impulses of the time spirit, Michael, to pour clarity, absolute clarity, into human souls. If one wishes to follow the Archangel Michael, it is necessary to pour clarity into human souls, to overcome sleepiness. This sleepiness arises in other spheres also, but above all it is an absolute necessity today to gain insight into the consequences of things. In previous ages this was different. During the centuries prior to the Michael age, in which European mankind was governed by the Archangel Gabriel, the compromises which human beings made in their thinking were lessened by the influence of the spiritual world. Michael is the spirit who works in the most eminent sense with the freedom of man. Michael will always do what is necessary. You must not believe that Michael fails to do the right thing. In the unconscious regions of the soul of every human being, there is today sharply outlined every contour and angle of the spiritual life. It is there. Anyone who is at all capable of bringing to the surface what exists in the depths of the soul life as latent visions knows what it is that lives today in the souls as discrepancies and unrelated facts. He knows that in the souls there live side by side the modern materialistic psychiatry which does not shrink from seeing an epileptic in the Christ Jesus, and even the acknowledgement of the Christ Jesus. Anyone who is at all capable of raising these things into consciousness becomes aware of these facts. It would be interesting if a good painter with a real understanding of our present time would paint, quote, Christ seen from the point of view of a modern psychiatrist, close quote, depicting it expressionistically. The result would be very interesting if the painter had a real understanding of what takes place at the present time in the depths of human soul life. You see, in our time, we have to plumb the depths if we wish to grasp what takes place at the surface of existence. But one can understand, on the other hand, that people are seized by a certain cowardice and discouragement if they are to approach the indicated matter. This is the other quality necessary today, courage, even a certain audacity in perceiving, in thinking, an audacity that does not dull our concepts, but makes them highly acute. Everything that has to be said today may be found in outer events. The spiritual researcher simply describes it more precisely, because he sees it against its proper background. And if the spiritual researcher then describes this background, the outer events will corroborate all the more what has, for example, been indicated today. People ask, what shall I do? It is so obvious what one should do. One should open one's eyes. One's spiritual eyes, to be sure. If one opens one's eyes, the will follow. The will depends upon our life situation. It is not always possible in one's particular circumstances, according to one's karma, to do the right thing. But one must try to open one's eyes spiritually. Today, however, the following often happens. If one tries to impart to people in words what is necessary for the present age, they quickly close their eyes. They swiftly turn their minds away from it. This is the descending of the scales on the other side. What I am saying here might be considered a criticism of our age, but this is not my intention. My purpose is to draw attention to the impulses that must enter human souls, human minds out of the spiritual world, if we wish to get beyond the catastrophic times in which we live. As I have stated, it is not possible to enter into concrete details. Each of you can do that for himself.